In the beginning, the earth was a vastly different place from what we see today. As we look back to the time before the Great Flood, we are faced with a world filled with mystery, complexity, and untold stories. Many of us are familiar with the flood narrative from the Bible, particularly the account of Noah and his ark. But what was the world like before the flood? What kind of environment existed, and how did humanity live? The biblical account of Genesis provides us with a glimpse into this ancient world. And although there are many unknowns, there are also valuable clues that help us piece together a picture of what life was like before the waters rose. In this first part, we will take a closer look at the world before the flood, the environment in which Noah and his ancestors lived, and what the earth might have looked like. We will dive into the mystery of the pre-flood world and explore the geographical, environmental, and social aspects of that time. Let's start by laying the groundwork and understanding the state of the earth as described in Genesis. In the book of Genesis, we are told that after the creation of the world, God looked upon his creation and declared it very good. But over time, the earth began to change. The human race, starting with Adam and Eve, began to multiply. Yet, as we see in Genesis 6:5, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The world had become corrupted by sin, and the purity that God had originally placed in his creation was being eroded. Before this corruption, though, what was the world like? What were the conditions on earth prior to the flood that would eventually wipe out most of humanity, sparing only Noah and his family? The Bible does not provide us with a detailed blueprint of the pre-flood world, but we can look at the context provided in Scripture to begin to understand the environment and society in which these early humans lived. One of the key aspects of the pre-flood world is the idea that the earth was different in many ways. First, we can look at the geographical features. In Genesis 2:5-6, it is stated that before the rain fell on the earth, a mist rose from the ground to water the whole surface of the earth. This suggests that the earth may not have had the same kind of rain cycles we are familiar with today. In the early days of creation, a more constant temperate climate existed, and there was no need for the kind of weather systems that we have now. Additionally, there was no sea as we understand it today. Genesis 1:9-10 tells us that God gathered the waters together to form the seas, which happened during the third day of creation. This suggests that the earth may have been one large landmass, much like the idea of the supercontinent Pangaea. It is even possible that the continents were much closer together before the flood, and the landscape was far more unified than the fractured world we know today. There's also the idea of a water canopy, mentioned in some interpretations of the pre-flood world. This is a fascinating concept based on the idea that the earth was covered by a dense layer of water vapor in the atmosphere, creating a greenhouse effect that maintained a warm and uniform climate around the globe. This water canopy could have provided the earth with an abundant supply of moisture and warmth, contributing to the lushness of the environment before the flood. The lack of extreme weather conditions could have led to long lifespans for the early generations, as we see in the genealogies of the Old Testament, where individuals lived for hundreds of years. Imagine a world where there is no harsh winter or summer, a time when Plants grew effortlessly, and the earth was a kind of paradise. It would have been a time when the environment was so favorable that even after the flood, we see that plants grew in abundance, though this time in a much more challenging world. It's possible that the pre-flood world had a beauty and balance that we can only dream of now. While the physical features of the earth were distinct from what we know today, the society of the people was also markedly different. Before the flood, the human population grew rapidly, as stated in Genesis 6:1-9, which reads, "When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose." This passage speaks to the growing human population, but it also hints at something deeper, a societal structure that was quickly becoming corrupted. The sons of God mentioned in this verse have often been interpreted in various ways. Some scholars believe they refer to angels, while others suggest they are the descendants of Seth, the righteous line of Adam. Regardless of the interpretation, this verse highlights the growing complexity of the human condition before the flood. Instead of following God's design for creation, humanity was veering off course, and the consequences of this deviation would eventually be felt in the divine judgment of the flood. As the generations multiplied, so did the evil that pervaded their hearts. The influence of sin was so widespread that, as mentioned earlier, every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Bible tells us that human violence and corruption had reached a peak, and God saw no choice but to bring judgment upon the earth. But before the flood came, there was a man chosen by God to preserve life and righteousness. This man was Noah, who was described as righteous in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6:9 tells us, "Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God." Despite the darkness and corruption that pervaded the world, Noah stood out as a beacon of hope. Before God could bring his judgment upon the earth, he decided to spare Noah and his family. God instructed Noah to build an ark, a massive vessel that would save him, his family, and 2 of every kind of animal from the coming flood. The story of Noah's ark is one of faith, obedience, and divine protection. It serves as a testament to the importance of following God's guidance, even in the face of immense challenges. In the next sections, we will delve deeper into the events that led up to the flood. We'll explore the rise of wickedness and how God's judgment unfolded, ultimately reshaping the world. We'll also examine the significance of Noah's faith and how it changed the course of human history. But for now, let's take a moment to reflect on what the world before the flood may have looked like. It was a world of beauty and harmony, but it was also a world that was beginning to spiral into chaos. This tension between divine goodness and human corruption set the stage for one of the most significant events in the history of the world, the flood, which would forever change the course of creation. In conclusion, the pre-flood world was one of immense beauty and harmony, but it was also a world that was deeply corrupted by human sin. The people of that time had deviated from God's intended purpose, and the consequences of their actions would soon be realized in the flood. However, amidst the darkness, there was one man who stood faithful to God, and through his obedience, God's plan for salvation would be fulfilled. As we reflect on the world before the flood, we are reminded of the importance of living in harmony with God's will and following His guidance, just as Noah did. Though the flood brought judgment, it also brought hope. Hope for a new beginning and the chance for humanity to start again. The world before the flood was not only a land of beauty and prosperity, but also a place where human ambition reached extraordinary heights. As generations passed, people discovered new ways to harness the land, the water, and the sky. They built structures far beyond what we might imagine for such ancient times, and their knowledge grew as they experimented with tools, trade, and even the beginnings of governance. Yet, woven into this story of progress was also the beginning of corruption, pride, and arrogance. It was a time when the line between harmony and decay was becoming dangerously thin. At the heart of early civilization were the cities, magnificent in their scale for the ancient world. Walls of stone surrounded marketplaces where merchants shouted the value of their goods. Fabrics dyed with rare colors, jars of honey and oil, baskets of figs and pomegranates, and metals hammered into shining tools. These markets were alive with the sound of hundreds of voices, the cries of animals, and the laughter of children darting between stalls. Every detail reflected a thriving society, one that had mastered the art of working together. Life was not only about survival, but also about beauty. Many families decorated their homes with carvings and patterns that reflected their beliefs in the divine. They built shrines at the edges of their villages, where incense curled into the sky, and sacrifices were offered to seek blessings of rain, harvest, or protection from predators. Elders told stories of creation, of the first man and woman, and of the generations that followed. These traditions were passed down carefully, giving each child a sense of connection to both the land and the heavens. Nature itself seemed grander than what we know today. Rivers flowed wider, forests were denser, and animals roamed in numbers that are hard for us to imagine. Herds of wild oxen shook the ground as they thundered across the plains. Massive birds with wingspans wider than a man's reach glided silently over rivers. Strange creatures, now long extinct, mingled with the familiar lions, deer, bears, and wolves. It was a world teeming with life, vibrant and unspoiled, each detail reflecting a creation that was still fresh. Yet alongside this beauty, shadows began to grow. In the cities, the desire for wealth often overshadowed the values of justice and humility. Men who had once worked the soil with reverence for the earth now sought only greater profit and power. Leaders built palaces larger than needed, adorning them with treasures while the poor struggled. Warriors, once defenders of their people, began to use their strength to dominate others. The harmony that once bound families and tribes together began to fracture under the weight of greed. Despite this, daily life for many still carried a rhythm of peace. Families rose with the dawn, the soft glow of the rising sun illuminating their fields. Farmers guided oxen through the earth, planting seeds, while women prepared bread from the grain harvested the season before. Children carried clay pots to wells and streams, filling them with water as they laughed and splashed. In the evenings, families gathered around fires, telling stories, singing songs, and gazing at the heavens, where stars burned brighter than we see today. The people also began to organize into communities with specialized roles. Some were farmers, others shepherds, others craftsmen, and still others warriors or spiritual leaders. These roles gave structure to society, and many villages grew into bustling cities where thousands lived together. Roads connected these centers of life, paths worn by the footsteps of traders carrying goods across the land. Caravans of donkeys and camels brought salt, spices, and fabrics, linking communities separated by mountains and rivers. In these days, music and art flourished. Flutes carved from reeds, drums made from stretched hides, and stringed instruments filled the air with melody. Dancers moved in circles during festivals, their garments flowing, their faces lit with joy. Painters decorated clay vessels with intricate patterns, while builders designed structures that reflected both practicality and beauty. The desire to create was deeply rooted in humanity, an echo of the Creator's own design. But with creativity also came curiosity that sometimes strayed into arrogance. Some men began to believe that their strength and wisdom could rival even the divine. They boasted of their cities, their armies, and their wealth as though they were untouchable. Violence grew in certain regions where strong men built kingdoms through force and fear. Travelers spoke of regions where corruption spread like fire, where greed and cruelty were celebrated instead of shamed. Still, there were those who remained faithful, those who taught their children to honor the Creator, to walk humbly, and to care for the land. They prayed at stone altars, lifting their voices in songs of gratitude for harvests and rains. These families kept the flame of righteousness alive, even as much of the world began to turn away. They are remembered as the ones who resisted the tide of corruption that was beginning to swallow the earth. The skies themselves seemed to watch over this fragile balance. Some days were filled with radiant sunlight, casting everything in golden hues. Other days, storms would sweep across the land, with thunder echoing like the voice of judgment. Lightning would split the heavens, striking mountains and forests, reminding humanity of the power that lay beyond their control. Many looked at these storms with awe, but others ignored the warnings, choosing instead to build higher towers and gather more wealth. The world before the flood was not simply a paradise, it was a paradox. It was a place of breathtaking beauty and remarkable human achievement, but also of growing darkness. As humanity thrived, so too did pride, greed, and violence. The seeds of the flood were being planted not in the rivers or skies, but in the hearts of men. The second chapter of this story reminds us that the earth before the flood was not a silent land waiting for judgment. It was alive with sound, color, and life, filled with communities that laughed, worked, and dreamed. But it was also a world teetering on the edge of destruction, where the brilliance of human creativity was overshadowed by the rising tide of corruption. This balance between beauty and decay is what made the world before the flood both magnificent and tragic. The world before the flood was not only a place of abundance, beauty, and human achievement. It was also a world that carried within itself the seeds of corruption, pride, and rebellion against the Creator. While people enjoyed prosperity and advanced knowledge, their hearts slowly turned away from the source of life. At first, humanity lived in harmony, enjoying the gifts of creation and using their talents for good. But as generations passed, pride began to grow. Men looked at their own strength and claimed it as their own. They forgot that every gift, every talent, every moment of life had been given to them. Their wisdom, their ability to build, their creativity, these were meant to glorify God. Instead, they became tools to glorify themselves. The earth was filled with wonders, but slowly it became filled with violence. Where once there were gardens and songs, there now were weapons and wars. Where once people celebrated life, they began to dominate, enslave, and exploit one another. The hearts of men turned cold, and greed became the ruler of nations. Ancient writings describe how the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives. Some traditions interpret this as the righteous line of men mixing with those who did not follow God. Others describe these sons of God as heavenly beings who abandoned their place and brought corruption to the earth. No matter the interpretation, the message is the same. The world had crossed a line. A boundary was broken, and humanity embraced rebellion rather than obedience. The people before the flood were giants, not only in stature, but in arrogance. They lived long lives, built vast empires, and believed that nothing could stop them. They grew intoxicated with their own power. Their inventions became weapons. Their knowledge became a tool of manipulation. Their abundance became a reason for excess, drunkenness, and immorality. Violence spread like a plague. Cities that once echoed with music now rang with the cries of victims. Strong men dominated the weak. Kings declared themselves gods. Families broke apart as corruption and lust spread unchecked. Humanity was no longer content with harmony. It sought control and conquest. And God looked upon the earth. What he saw was not the beauty of creation, not the harmony of his design, but a world drowning in sin. The text says, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." Imagine that. Every thought, every desire, every plan was tainted with selfishness and violence. The angels, who had watched with awe as creation was first spoken into existence, now watched with sorrow as humanity defiled it. What was once pure had become corrupted. What was once sacred had become profane. Yet, even in the midst of all this darkness, there was a man. His name was Noah. Unlike the rest of the world, Noah walked with God. He was not perfect, but he was faithful. He listened. He obeyed. While the world around him mocked righteousness, Noah remained steadfast. It is here that the great turning point of history begins. God, in his justice, could not allow the corruption to spread endlessly. The earth, which had been filled with life, was now filled with violence, and the Creator declared that a cleansing must come. A judgment was approaching, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity to stop evil from consuming everything. But God's judgment was never without mercy. Amid the announcement of destruction, there was also a promise of salvation. Noah was chosen to build something that had never been seen before, an ark, a vessel of survival, a sign of hope in the midst of impending disaster. Before the flood, the world was given a warning. For years, Noah built the ark, his very labor a testimony to what was coming. With each plank of wood, each nail hammered into place, the people were reminded that judgment was near. But instead of listening, they laughed, they mocked. They continued in their ways, blinded by arrogance and unwilling to change. The third part of our journey through the pre-flood world shows us the duality of human history: greatness and downfall, abundance and corruption, warnings and mockery. It reminds us that humanity is capable of both brilliance and destruction, depending on where our hearts are aligned. The ancient world before the flood was not just a story of beauty. It was a story of warning, a mirror for every generation that would come after. For when humans forget their Creator, no matter how great their achievements, corruption always follows. As the years passed, Noah continued to work tirelessly on the ark. His hands were calloused, his back bent with age, but his spirit remained unshaken. The massive structure of wood now towered above the landscape, unlike anything humanity had ever seen. To those around him, it seemed absurd. They mocked him, laughed at him, and called him a fool. They saw no reason to believe that judgment was coming. After all, the earth was still filled with life, the rivers still flowed, and the sun still rose each morning. To them, the warnings of Noah were nothing more than madness. But in reality, each passing day brought them closer to the hour of reckoning. God's patience had been stretched to its limit. He had watched violence consume the land, immorality spread like a disease, and the cries of the innocent rise to heaven. The world was no longer the paradise it once had been. The people had chosen their path, rejecting righteousness for corruption. Yet in the midst of this, Noah remained a beacon of faith. He preached the coming judgment, warning all who would listen. His voice was strong, his words were filled with urgency, but hearts were hardened. They had grown blind, deaf to the truth, and unwilling to repent. Then came the first signs. The skies began to change. Clouds gathered where once the heavens had been clear. A heaviness filled the air, and even the strongest warriors felt a strange unease. But the people explained it away. "Storms come and go," they said. "This is nothing new." They continued to feast, to drink, to marry, and to build. Their laughter echoed across the valleys, while Noah's hammer struck against the wood of the ark, each blow a countdown to the end. When the ark was finished, it stood as a monument of obedience and faith. Its wooden frame stretched high, capable of carrying not only Noah's family, but also the living creatures of the earth. And then the unthinkable began to happen. Animals from every corner of creation began to move. Lions left their dens, doves flew in pairs, elephants marched with slow, thunderous steps, and even the smallest insects began their journey. The people of the land were astonished. They had never seen such a sight. Yet instead of believing, they turned this miracle into another reason for mockery. "Look at Noah," they shouted. "Even the beasts obey him. What madness is this?" Noah, however, knew what it meant. God himself was gathering the animals, guiding them into the ark. This was the final warning, yet still the world did not repent. The people continued in their wickedness, and their arrogance grew. Some even tried to stop the animals from entering, but nothing could hinder the hand of God. The creatures marched on 2 by 2 and took their places inside the ark. Then came the day. God spoke to Noah and commanded him and his family to enter. The moment was heavy with silence. Noah looked at the faces of his neighbors, men and women he had known all his life, and saw only scorn. Yet he obeyed. He entered the ark with his wife, his sons, and their wives. The door stood open wide for all who would come, but no one did. And then something extraordinary happened. The door of the ark, massive and impossible for a man to close, began to move. Slowly, with a deep groaning sound, it shut. It was not Noah's hand that sealed it, but God's. The time of mercy had ended. The skies darkened further. Thunder rolled across the heavens, lightning split the sky, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The people laughed again. "Is this the great judgment Noah spoke of?" just a little rain. But the rain did not stop. It grew heavier, pouring in torrents. Rivers swelled, valleys filled, and the ground turned to mud beneath their feet. Within hours, the laughter turned to fear. The fountains of the deep burst open. Water gushed from the earth itself, joining the downpour from the sky. The people ran to higher ground, their cries rising in desperation. Families clung together, children wept, and the mighty men who once ruled in arrogance now trembled like frightened children. They pounded on the ark's walls, begging to be let inside, but the door was sealed. Noah's heart ached, but he knew it was too late. Judgment had begun. The waters rose higher and higher. Cities were swallowed, temples collapsed, and the monuments of human pride vanished beneath the flood. The giants, once feared by men, found themselves powerless against the wrath of nature. They fought the rising waters with all their might, but none could prevail. Their voices were silenced, their strength broken. Inside the ark, there was silence. Noah and his family could hear the storm raging outside, the cries of the dying, and the roar of the waters. Yet within, there was peace. God's presence was with them. The ark groaned and rocked as the waves lifted it from the ground, but it did not break. The vessel of faith carried them safely above the destruction, while below the world was being washed away. And so it was. The flood covered the earth. The mountains were swallowed, the plains disappeared, and the world as it once had been was no more. The paradise of lush valleys and mighty cities was gone, replaced by endless waters. The laughter of the wicked was silenced, and the rebellion of men had met its end. But within the ark, hope remained. For though judgment had come, God's plan was not finished. Humanity would rise again, not in the strength of arrogance, but in the humility of obedience. And the story of Noah would live on as a reminder: God is patient, but his justice is sure. When the storm finally began to lose its fury, the world had been utterly transformed. For 40 days and 40 nights, relentless rain had poured from the heavens. The fountains of the deep had erupted, tearing apart the land, reshaping mountains and valleys. Every city, every home, every monument of human pride had been swallowed by the waters. Where once there had been fertile fields, bustling marketplaces, and towering temples, now there was only a vast, endless ocean stretching to the horizon. The earth had been cleansed, but at a cost beyond comprehension. Inside the ark, however, there was life. Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives tended carefully to the animals. Lions rested beside lambs, birds sang softly in the wooden beams, and elephants swayed gently as the ark rocked on the waves. The family grew accustomed to the rhythm of survival, feeding, cleaning, praying, and waiting. The sound of rain on the ark's roof had become a constant companion, but in their hearts, hope flickered like a steady flame. Finally, the day came when the heavens grew silent. The rain stopped, the thunder faded, the lightning no longer split the sky. The ark drifted on waters that were calmer, though the world outside remained covered in an endless sea. The silence was almost eerie after so many weeks of chaos, but it was also a sign God's judgment had ended and a new chapter was about to begin. Then the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. Slowly the waters began to recede, revealing peaks and ridges, bare earth still wet and glistening. Day by day the family inside could see change. Where once there had been nothing but water, now land was beginning to appear. The promise of life returning filled their hearts with renewed strength. Noah sent out a raven. and it flew back and forth across the waters, searching for land. Later, he sent a dove. The first time, it found no place to rest and returned. Days later, he sent it again, and it returned with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak. The family rejoiced, for it was a sign that trees had begun to grow again, that the world was healing. When Noah sent the dove once more, it did not return, showing that the earth was ready to receive life again. At last, the great wooden door of the ark was opened. The family stepped out, squinting in the sunlight, breathing deeply the fresh air of a renewed world. The animals followed in pairs, stepping cautiously onto the soft, damp earth. The ground was quiet, as though holding its breath, waiting for life to take root once more. What had been destroyed was now ready for restoration. Noah built an altar to the Lord, offering sacrifices of thanksgiving. The smoke rose gently into the sky, a symbol of gratitude and faith. And God responded with a covenant, a promise that never again would the world be destroyed by floodwaters. To seal this promise, he placed a rainbow across the sky. Brilliant colors arched across the heavens, shimmering in the light, a sign of mercy after judgment, a reminder of hope after despair. Imagine that moment, the first rainbow ever seen, stretching across the new, cleansed earth. Noah and his family gazed upon it with awe, tears in their eyes, knowing that they were witnessing the beginning of humanity's second chance. Every drop of color was a whisper of grace, a declaration that God had not abandoned his creation, but had given it new life. The world after the flood was not the same as before. The climate had shifted, the earth scarred by waters, the skies and seasons changed. Humanity would have to adapt, to rebuild, to spread once more across the land, but with every step, they would remember the ark, the flood, and the rainbow. These were not just events of survival, but eternal lessons, lessons about faith, obedience, judgment, and mercy. And so, as Noah's descendants began to populate the world again, the story of the flood became the foundation of memory for all nations. Across cultures and civilizations, echoes of this great deluge would appear in legends and myths, but only in Scripture do we see its true meaning, not just destruction, but salvation through faith and obedience. The flood reminds us even today of the fragility of life, the weight of human choices, and the depth of divine mercy. Though judgment came, mercy triumphed. Though the waters rose, hope was never drowned, and in the rainbow, humanity was given a symbol to carry through every generation, that no matter how dark the storm, light and promise will always return. So, when we look at the rainbow in our own skies, we are reminded of Noah's story. We are reminded of a world that once drowned in its own corruption, and of the God who gave mankind a second chance. It is a call to live differently, to walk with humility, and to cherish the life that was preserved for us. This is not only the end of the story of the flood, it is also the beginning of humanity's renewed journey on earth. A journey filled with trials, victories, and the constant presence of divine grace. And now, dear friends, as we conclude this incredible journey into the story of the flood, I invite you to do something special. Just as Noah lifted up his prayer of thanksgiving when he stepped onto the new earth, let us also lift up our voices together. In the comments below, write your own short prayer. It could be a prayer of gratitude, of hope, or of asking God to help you stay faithful even in the storms of life. Let this place become filled with prayers, like a digital altar rising up to heaven. May every comment be a testimony that even today, thousands of years after the rainbow first appeared in the sky, God's promise still lives in our hearts.